It's wonderful to be back with you, to be released from my writer's cave for a day, and to enjoy this gorgeous fall day. I hope you have been enjoying that beauty of fall as well. I love this time of year. Of course, you're likely to hear me say that at every season, but especially I love the spring and the fall. And I also really, really like the time change thing. I don't really like the time change thing, but I like that we all buy into it. And it's really fun to observe. And so you notice when fall comes around, we start to get excited that we're going to have more time. Someone said to me the other day, oh, I love having that extra hour. So when you think about how the mind works and how we can just change our mind, right? And just decide it's another time. Just decide we have an extra hour. When you know, did anyone tell you there's actually the same number of hours in the day? But we feel we get an extra hour. And then I notice during this time of the time change, when I have an extra hour, I'm excited about that extra hour. And then it's kind of like a change that you have in consciousness, right? Where you recognize something. But then you keep going back to the old consciousness, keep going back to the old worry, just kind of tapping into it. So you have this new insight. You see the way things are, but you keep going back. So during time change, do you find yourself saying, okay, this is what time it is now, but what time is it really? Right? And we do that for a little while. We go back and forth, like what time is it really? And I always have a few clocks that I don't change to just sort of help me navigate through that period. So I find it fascinating to watch how we can change our minds and what happens when we change our minds. In this case, of course, everybody's excited about getting an extra hour. So I've been watching myself as I've been in this process of working on this book. I'm working on a new book, and I have a publishing contract that, at first I was so excited about, and, now I'm terrified about, because it has a deadline, and it's really soon. And so I've been writing, working on it. And plus it was a book that, it came out of the course I did several years ago. I felt it was just a done deal. The book was done, and, put the proposal out. And then when it was time I figured I'll just polish it up and send it out. I looked at it, and it was gone. It wasn't missing, but what I thought was there was not there. So, but I noticed that I got really wrapped up in the time thing, like deadline and shortage of time. And the more I got into this consciousness of I'm under a deadline and there's not enough time, the worse it got. And the worse I got. And then you notice if you're in that kind of frenzy, people ask how you are and you say, And then your friends and your family will first they start advising you. Then they stay away from you. But the first attempt is to advise you, So I got lots of advice like, why don't you just take a break? Why don't you go outside, smell the flowers, and so one of my good friends, Phil Goldberg, who's also a writer. Many other writers will just sympathize, right? But so Phil decided he was going to encourage me So he sent me an article and said, you know, this will help you move along really quickly. And it was out of a book about Ulysses S. Grant and writing his memoirs, which he did in 1 year. And this man, who they said was very quiet and precise in his language, was not one to be verbose. They said he actually could speak silence in several languages. But he came to write his memoirs because he was concerned about his wife, because the military did not have pensions at that time. And it turns out that he had a terminal diagnosis. So this is the support my friend sends me. So he says, look, under threat of death, Ulysses S. Grant writes 336,000 words in 1 year, this 2-volume memoir that becomes one of the classics of American literature. One day alone, he dictated 9,000 words, and not to mention that he dies the week after the book comes out. So your friends will give you advice, and they'll try to support you. So I realized that what I needed to do was change my mind, because there wasn't going to be any more or any less time. I was just going to experience it differently, depending on what my mental outlook was, right? So whatever is happening in our life, that's the way it is. We are going to experience it according to our consciousness, which we actually do have the power to change. We just forget that we do. So I got in this space where my consciousness was getting more and more contracted. And what I needed to do was expand my consciousness again. Paramahansa Yogananda wrote, "The mind is like an elastic band. The more you pull, the more it stretches. Every time you feel limitations, close your eyes and say to yourself, 'I am the infinite.'" So there is no reason that we have to live in that contraction. It doesn't help anything. Have you noticed? It doesn't help a thing. And it doesn't help the people around us either. So this beautiful advice is close your eyes and say, "I am the infinite. That is my life. Spirit is my essence, my true self, unbounded, timeless, unlimited." You know what? Why would I have to have this fear-based conversation that says there's not going to be enough time, when there is another conversation that's just as valid that says there's plenty of time and there's an abundance of grace? So which conversation do we choose for ourselves? So in order to get out of my time bind, I really had to follow this advice of Paramahansa Yogananda, which is to lift my consciousness beyond time and space. In other words, have a visit to the divine self. To get out of timelines, out of conditions, into the infinite allness that is spirit. And of course, we can do that in our meditation. And we do it in our meditation. I hope you did it in your meditation this morning. But the thing is, then, to not keep going back and say, what time is it really? how do I really feel about this? No, you have a new mind. You have a new consciousness. And you have the ability to purify the mental field of worry and contraction. There's a great Sufi story that I like. It's a story about this villager who was so in love with the king of the village, so enamored of the king, that whenever he had an opportunity, he would go to visit the king. But he had so much love and respect for the king that whenever he came into the court, into the king's presence, he would just fall into ecstasy and lose awareness of anything else other than being in the king's presence. So everybody in the village knew that he had this devoted and strong relationship with the king. So whenever he was going to visit the king, the other villagers would say, look, you're going to go visit the king. You have this thing. You have this nice relationship with the king. So please take my request with you. Let me write it down, my prayer request. This is what I need. Take it with you to the king and present it to the king for me. And he would say, how can I do that? Because as soon as I'm there with the king, I lose consciousness of myself. All there is that divine presence. But he would take their requests anyway in his little bag, go to the village. People would give their special requests of what they wanted, what they needed. I would give the request, I would like more time to work on the book. Put it in the little bag. And so he goes into the king, and sure enough, as soon as he sees the king in that glory and that magnificence, and he feels that love for the king, he just collapses into the ecstasy of meditation. And all concern of himself or anyone else is gone. And there's this little bag filled with the requests. So the king says, what has my beautiful villager brought with him today? So he opens the bag while the villager is just Om Shanti. He opens the bag and takes out the requests and he signs them all off, plus giving more than people even asked for, puts them back in the bag. The villager knows nothing of it. He goes back. Everyone's prayers are answered. And then the story says that these prayers were always answered in abundance beyond what was asked, versus the prayers of those who came into the king and made a case for what they needed. So it has to do with being at the mental level, being at the spiritual level. Do you see? So this villager who came into the presence of the king, symbolizing the divine presence, forgot about himself, forgot about his deadlines, forgot about conditions he was facing, forgot about trouble in relationship, only was there communing with the one. And in that, there is a change in consciousness. And from that, the flow can open up. Can you imagine for me as a writer that I am, writing at the one time worrying about what time it is, versus being able to be in the flow where divine ideas can come, and divine inspiration, and divine healing, and divine blessing. And this is how it is for all of us. It's just the ability to see when we have moved into the apartment of contracted mind. And anytime we want to, we can open that door and move out. Because Spirit is always inviting us to expand our consciousness and to live in a higher way. And these stories in all the traditions abound of the ability to simply come in, commune, Come in, sit, let go, be. And let your life flow from that place. So I have a poem about that, which I'll read, and then we'll conclude. This one you've heard before, but it's the perfect one for this, I think. It's about this choice that we have. You know, life is... So I want you to know that on my list of what I had to accomplish each day, I added to the list, be happy. It's a good thing to put on the list. Because if that is not what we are doing each day, to live more fully, in a more open-hearted way, then when is it? And what are we tying our happiness to? Am I going to be any happier when the book comes out? No. There'll just be something else. If you live long enough, you figure that out. Or your husband or your wife will remind you. So, to answer this call, to come into the court, into communion with that divine self. This poem is called Fire in My Heart. Some days I sit near your fire, feeding it the kindling of desire. Live in the way the Buddha said, and the light will grow in you. Live in the way the Buddha said, and the light will grow in you. Sorrow and joy come in, sit down together as friends. Everything that is needed appears. Sorrow and joy come in, sit down together as friends, and everything that is needed appears. Other days, I forget about that light. I set out alone in the dark, ambitious prodigal with damp wood, determined to start my own fire. When the invitation to the heavenly feast arrives from the universe, I politely decline. I have prepared a feast for you. Will you come? No, I'm too busy. I'm too busy with matters of life and death. I insist on my own way, saying no to love, saying no to love until no becomes sand in my mouth. Why all this suffering, I ask? Come, sit by the fire. Forget about life and death, being and doing, coming and going. Soon the sitar will begin. Its notes will make you weep for everything lost and gained, for the extravagant mercy of the One.